Hello, everyone, and welcome to Character Gallery. I'm one of your hosts, MasterOfTheLemons, and today I'm here with a guest host, Dustin, Rudy Productions. Say hello.
Hello.
So today we're going to be talking about Skarloey as a character. And I think the best thing to go over first is just generally what we think of him as a character. So, Dustin, what do you think? What do you first think of when you think of Skarloey? Who is he to you?
Skarloey is kind of the sage of the narrow gauge railway. He's been around a long time, a very long time. So he's kind of, been there, done that, seen it all, and and is kind of just like he's the Skarloey Railway's version of Edward.
Yeah, and I get why they got along so well in Four Little Engines, and why they really kind of meshed. Because the thing is, there are a lot of little moments that I love where Skarloey just, very much like Edward, in any given situation, he's kind of making sure that tensions stay low and that everybody's good. He kind of moderates the mood of any given situation. I love that moment. There's this moment in, I think it's Duke the Lost Engine, because it's but Peter Sam is saying something like, I can't believe that the Duke that came wasn't our Duke. It was some weird human Duke, right? And then Duncan chimes in and says, would you finally get over it, Peter Sam? That there are no engine Dukes anymore. You heard what Duke said. And Duncan's just, blatant like that, right? He's just going to say, okay, just, cut it out, right? You heard the facts. Duke is dead, get over it, right? But then Skarloey chimes in and he says, Duck doesn't know everything. Please, tell us about Duke, Peter Sam. He chimes in with that, right? And it's a little line, and it even says that he said it quietly, but it's that line means a lot, because you can see the situation slowly escalating. You can see tensions rising a lot, and then Skarloey cuts in, and that's exactly the moment he decides to intervene. Just because he can see that Peter Sam is getting really upset, and Duncan's making it a lot worse, and so he's jumping in, trying to moderate that situation. I could totally see Edward doing that, It's and of course there's all the wisdom he has too, but the emotional... the emotional intelligence, I think, is very similar to what Edward has as well. I really love that.
Right. Though I see the one difference between Skarloey and Edward is kind of Skarloey is not afraid to kind of use a little trickery to cause an engine to be put in their place, like in a Steamroller, where he kind of tricked Sir Handel into his rivalry with George.
I think Edward will pull the strings sometimes, but I don't think he would be so cheeky, where it's there's a few examples I think of. The whole Steamroller thing is a great one. There's also in Mountain Engines where Skarloey and Rheneas never mention that the Godred story was made up by Coldy. Right. They just both kind of, because they're okay, Sir Handel and Duncan deserve it. We'll just kind of let them believe that it's true.
Right. And I think it's fair to mention is that based off of the episodes that I went back and rewatched, is that Skarloey does seem to have quite an admiration for Rheneas, based on what Rheneas has done for the railway. He kind of holds him up in a high regard. I know there are episodes where he's talking to the engines, and it's maybe Rheneas will be able to teach you sense.
Yeah, he does say that a lot, and I think Skarloey and Rheneas. I really get the vibe that Rheneas is the older brother out of the two. And then Skarloey, the vibe I get is
even when Rheneas first arrived in the Very Old Engines book, he kind of already acted more mature than Skarloey.
Yeah.
Then again, I think Skarloey was bred to think that he was just going to be this grand passenger engine, and then Rheneas was kind of already aware of the fact that I'm gonna be stuck doing the dirty work, so maybe that has something to do with it.
Yeah, I think that Rheneas is just he's just naturally more practical. And so he kind of and it's a very interesting dynamic, because I think a lot of people view these two characters like they're the same, and I think they're very different. Rheneas, because I think the most
if Skarloey is a little bit mischievous, Rheneas is kind of if Skarloey is the old wise one, Rheneas is the fun uncle.
I would say the opposite, actually. I would say, because the thing is, Rheneas is the one, because this goes back to like very old engines, right? Where you've got like all the past stories back when they first arrived.
Yeah.
And I think because Rheneas is the one there who's kind of more down to earth and practical.
True. Yeah.
And then like Skarloey is this bucking bronco who just doesn't like take anything from anybody.
That might be some of the newer episodes tainting my view of Rheneas.
Yeah,
because
that's the thing. Like I was gonna say, Blue Mountain Mystery, like. I would swap Skarloey and Rheneas, like, almost exactly, in how I view them. I would totally describe Skarloey as, like, the fun uncle. The thing is, Rheneas holding up the entire railway for years is such a big part of his character arc and his personality, and I think that really hardened him. I think he really became... I think, to an extent, Skarloey was sheltered from just the effort that Rheneas had to put in to keep the railway alive, and really what he had to endure and struggle through. Skarloey doesn't fully understand that, and I think that's partially because of Rheneas, because Rheneas really didn't want him to have to endure it. I see Skarloey and Rheneas a lot like Rheneas is like 17 and Skarloey is like 12, and the two of them are brothers and they've been orphaned. And Rheneas is like, and it's like the 1800s or something, and they're like Rheneas is working really hard, working like 3 jobs, trying to keep the two of them alive, and he comes home, in the middle of the night covered in coal dust, and Skarloey wakes up and he's just like, where have you been all night? And Rheneas is just like, oh, don't worry about that.
Yeah, that's actually perfect.
And I think Skarloey, now that he's matured more and gotten older and realized just all the stuff that Rheneas has really been through, just by inferring it, because Rheneas would never brag about all the things he's done for this railway. Skarloey has realized, oh my god, he did so much for me. And it's no surprise at all that he so often points to Rheneas as an example of what an engine should try to be, because I'm sure he really looks up to him and takes inspiration from him.
Yeah. And one thing that I kind of was thinking of is that, I think it's kind of overlooked how Skarloey was kind of used to be, kind of childish and vain almost. It gives me hope for characters like James.
That's interesting because, like, I would say, well, James is already... He's like, well, at this point, he's over 100. But, like, Skarloey and Rheneas are 150. The thing is, Skarloey and Rheneas have been around so long that I think, like, Duke is younger than them. Yeah. And the thing about Duke is still very stuffy, and he's very judgmental, and very, like, some of his ideas are probably a little bit backwards. He's got a very rigid idea of what an engine should be, how engines around him should act, and he's very restrictive of those around him. And I think Skarloey and Rheneas have kind of lost that a little bit when they've gotten older. When they got so old, they got to the point where they've literally seen...
They've seen enough time to know that change is inevitable, and to kind of let the young ones do their thing, but kind of keep them on the right path all the same.
Yeah, exactly. And the interesting thing is that once Duke comes to the Skarloey Railway, we never really hear from him how he... We don't hear much from him anymore.
Right.
And the thing is, Duke respects authority, and he respects the fact that...
he respects that Skarloey and Rheneas, they've been there since the beginning, they're the number 1 and 2, they're clearly the guys in charge.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing, Duke shows up, and he realizes that, and so even if maybe he doesn't totally agree with the way they view the world, he's still gonna respect them, because that's part of his code. I'm sure I think they would enlighten him a little bit, because he'd meet these 150-year-old engines, right?
Right.
And he would expect them to share all of his very rigid rules about things. And then they would actually be pretty chill. Like, Skarloey and Rheneas are pretty chill. They're pretty understanding. Rheneas, I think, is stricter than Skarloey. I think he's kind of... The way I kind of describe the difference between the two is, like, Rheneas is the type of engine that if Sir Handel or Peter Sam or somebody has a problem, right? They go to Rheneas if they need to make some sort of important plan, or if they're in a dangerous situation and they don't know what to do, or if there's an emergency, they go to Rheneas, right?
Right.
But if they need somebody to vent to, if they need somebody to understand how they're feeling and to give them emotional advice, they go to Skarloey.
Yeah.
That's how I see the two of them.
Rheneas is definitely kind of the man of action of the railway, while Skarloey is kind of camp counselor.
Yeah, exactly. because their two worldviews, I think, are different. Skarloey, I think, is a little bit more of an optimist. He's a little bit more, understanding and a little bit more tolerant of when an engine makes a mistake, or when he's kind of more of a dreamer, right?
Yeah.
So if Peter Sam has this amazing idea for the railway, or some big idea for a festival or something, that
Skarloey would be the one to kind of listen to Peter Sam and be like, yes,
yeah.
I think that's a good idea. That could work. If you should talk to the thin controller about that.
Yeah, exactly. And then Rheneas would be like, would kind of point out, not in a rude way, but he'd point out the flaws, where he'd be like, well, that's a nice idea, Peter Sam, but at the same time, we do have trains scheduled, and we can't do that. And, it's not exactly reasonable to drop everything and do this festival now, is it? Think
kind of like a mellowed out Duncan.
That's the thing. It's like, it's Duncan honestly is interesting because he gets a really bad rap from everybody, but I do respect him a lot for being so honest and direct. When Duncan thinks something isn't going to work, he's going to tell you to your face, like, you're an idiot, right? And you kind of like him for it, because he's not totally wrong a lot of the time. He's kind of right. Like, he'll say the thing that nobody else is going to say, and we kind of like to hear that, because we're like, yeah, finally somebody said it, right? Whereas Rheneas won't say unnecessary things. Duncan just says whatever goes through his head. He does not...
Duncan has no filter.
Yeah, exactly. He has no filter. Whereas Rheneas, everything that he says, he definitely believes in, but he doesn't say everything that goes through his head. He speaks when he has something important to say, when he thinks somebody needs to hear what he's going to say. Now, that's not to say he doesn't talk a lot. I'm sure he has casual conversation with the other engines all the time, but he doesn't confront somebody or give a controversial idea unless he knows that it's necessary to make the situation better. Whereas Duncan will just give any controversial idea he thinks of on any occasion. Whereas Skarloey speaks, Skarloey kind of, he'll maybe gossip with some of the other engines to an extent. If they do need to vent, if they do need to talk about something or complain about something, he'll entertain that. Now,
Skarloey's a very good listener.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas, like, and there are, you can push Skarloey to his limit, right? Like Duncan complains so much that I'm sure Skarloey just wouldn't respect that very much.
Yeah, that was kind of the plot of Duncan the Humbug, where they were all brought down by Duncan's bad vibes.
Yeah, they were all just like, all of them at some point just struggled to tolerate him, which is interesting, because it's like, a personality like Duncan's on the Northwestern Railway, it produces, it's like somebody like Gordon. Not like Duncan and Gordon are very different, because Gordon is basically Duncan, but dressed up as an aristocrat with a lot of prejudices attached. But they do have something in common, which is that they're both very rude. And Gordon is so rude, and yet he's kind of respected by the whole railway. Obviously, there's a lot of engines annoyed by him and also who have their feelings hurt by him.
But they also know that Gordon kind of has a reason for why he acts so pompous. He kind of is the
premier express engine. On some level, they kind of ignore how rude he is, because they kind of respect how big and strong he is, which is kind of an unhealthy dynamic. I mean, Gordon is kind of allowed to keep being the top dog, even though he's inconsiderate, because of his status. Whereas, like, Duncan never is. Everyone is just, like, furious with him when he acts like that. Gordon never gets a moment where everyone has a big meeting and they're like, Gordon, you're ridiculous. Why are you such a jerk? Right? We need to figure out a way to get back at him. That doesn't happen. Gordon just keeps on being a jerk, and they kind of just tolerate him. But, like, on the Skarloey Railway, it seems like it's a lot healthier there. It seems like they actually talk about their problems openly. It seems like they actually have meetings where they talk about somebody who's hurting their feelings. And I think that this has a lot to do with Skarloey. I think that it's kind of an extension of his own perspective on things, where he hears everybody out, he makes sure that he moderates the situation and that he stops people from getting upset, and that's kind of how he acts in any given situation. And so it makes sense that when you've got Skarloey as one of the patriarchs of this railway, that you're going to have meetings like these, and that you're going to actually have everyone openly talking about their problems, discussing when somebody's hurting their feelings, and they're able to say, hey, I don't like how this engine is acting, right?
Right.
The patriarch of the Northwestern Railway, is Gordon.
Yeah.
Now the one who's kind of gluing everything together and holding everyone, keeping everyone sane is Edward.
Right.
But the one who's kind of the one who's kind of the head of the Northwestern, who everyone kind of looks up to as like, the senior member of the principal team of engines, is Gordon. Right?
Right.
And that's a really weird dynamic. Like, that's really not healthy for the railway.
The way I've always seen it for the Northwestern is, like, Gordon is kind of the patriarch of the railway. Edward is kind of what keeps everyone mentally sane, while then there's Thomas, who's just the guy they put on the billboards.
Yeah. That's the thing. It's like he's kind of the mascot almost. Yeah. And it's probably frustrating to Gordon, because for years Gordon was the mascot, and then all of a sudden the TV series comes out, and I'm sure that the 1984 is the year that the railway switched from putting Gordon on the billboards to Thomas, and then Gordon's like, "What the hell is that?"
The fat controller's changing everything.
There'd be a lot of yelling in the sheds that night, I'll say that much. Gordon would not be pleased that Thomas has basically taken over. But yeah. So basically, I think Skarloey and Rheneas, their personalities shaped the entire railway, because they were the first engines there, and they spent so much time on it. I mean, they arrived in 1865, and then they the next time engines arrived was 1954 with Sir Handel and Peter Sam.
Right.
So that's almost like 100 years it was just
Skarloey and Rheneas witnessed the construction of the Northwestern Railway.
That is so weird. Like they probably. I mean, they saw. Well, then again, and they kind of did, kind of didn't, because I guess the Sodor and Mainland was there,
right?
And so. The Sodor and Mainland was there,
but
before
I'm sure they
arrived.
Went through and were replacing a lot of those tracks, making them stronger.
Yeah, that's the thing. They would have seen so many works trains. They would have seen Edward for the first time in red, Thomas for the first time in brown. They would have
which
they would have seen all that stuff.
I kind of think in my headcanon that Skarloey and Rheneas may have been what turned Edward into the character he is, because if you think of it, back when Edward was new, he was kind of an express engine, even on the Furness Railway, so he could have very well been the same arrogant type of character as Gordon.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I've never heard that before. That's a really good idea. This is something I'd never thought of before, which is the idea that Edward started out really arrogant. It started out like you'd expect an engine to start out. And then Skarloey and Rheneas, because they've been around so long by that point, would be able to enlighten him like that. That's a really interesting idea, because it's like, I mean, that would honestly make a lot of sense. And like we were talking about earlier, where Skarloey and Edward are so they're so similar. Maybe that's because Edward took a lot of inspiration from Skarloey, especially because early on, long before Edward would have worked on his branch line, he would have worked the main line, and so he would have stopped at Crovan's Gate all the time. That's really interesting. That would be really cool to see. I don't know how it sits with me, the idea of Edward having been arrogant at some point. It seems almost...
I never think Edward has ever been, like, too arrogant, but I'm sure there is...
But maybe a little bit too big for his buffers. Yeah. Like, maybe he was...
Maybe not Gordon levels of arrogant, but maybe, like, Henry levels of arrogant.
or maybe like Skarloey when he first arrived, and then it kind of like... what Rheneas kind of was to Skarloey, maybe Skarloey was to Edward. That would be really interesting.
The only problem I have with my own theory here is that I also see Edward as a mentor figure to Thomas himself, and the idea that they both kind of came to Sodor around the same time-ish, so... Yeah,
that is a problem.
Right.
But
that's why it's a theory.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the thing is, it's like that's a problem I saw too, where it's like they both really arrived in 1915, and so where would the time be for Edward to kind of be enlightened? Unless you subscribe to the theory that Thomas arrived later, which you could do, I suppose. But yeah, so basically, I really do love Skarloey as a character. I think that he's really strongly informed, how the railway functions today and how it kind of, just the vibe of the whole place. I think that he's kind of the there's two sides to the railway, right? There's the ideas of discipline and practicality that Rheneas brings to it, and just logic in general, that he's very logical and practical. And then there's the Skarloey side of it, which is the fact that we do all have family meetings and talk about our problems, and we do all, we do listen to each other, we do respect each other, we are kind to each other, and I think it's very powerful that. I have to say I have a lot of respect for Duncan for being able to change his mind so easily in Passengers in Polish, where he basically hears one story, and then Duncan is like, "Thanks for telling me about him. I was wrong." And it's just like, that's it. And he's smiling while he says it, right? Like, yeah. Duncan is not afraid to change his mind. Duncan is very open-minded.
It's hard for him to change his mind sometimes, but, like, when he does, he does.
The thing is, it's like, I think it's hard for him if it's a tricky thing to figure out what the right answer is.
Right, yeah.
I think that the minute he's sure of the answer, he'll change his mind immediately, but it may take a while to become sure of that answer. Whereas somebody like Gordon, even if he sees good arguments for something, Gordon will just kind of dismiss it because he doesn't want to change his mind.
That doesn't apply to me because I'm an express engine and dignity and...
Yeah, exactly. He'll do that sort of thing. But, like, Duncan will very much, Duncan will change his mind if he sees reason to. Right. I think that Duncan does have a natural tendency to change his mind once he's presented with evidence, because that's how his mind works. However, Skarloey made it a lot easier by actually talking to him about it. When Duncan comes up and says, "Oh, why don't I get polished?" right? And Skarloey's still mad about the whole bridge incident that he had to personally clean up because he had to pull Duncan to the next station, right? Skarloey still doesn't bar his way and say, "Oh, well, I'm not talking to you about this. You're ridiculous." Instead, he just says, he tells him the story of Rheneas, right? He actually sits down with Duncan and says, "Okay, I'm going to explain this to you."
He's not going to outright tell you you're being unreasonable. He's going to try and explain it gently so you can slowly understand it.
Yeah, he's gonna guide you to the right conclusion.
He's like a signalman. As long as they're not sleeping.
Yes, that is the most Thomas analogy we could possibly give. Perfect. He's essentially, he's guiding Duncan in the right direction. That's a huge reason why the Skarloey Railway is so much more emotionally healthy than the Northwestern Railway. It's because Skarloey has this he has this great way about things where...
As much as Rheneas has done for the railway physically, Skarloey has done probably twice as much emotionally.
Exactly. And that's the thing. It's like, nobody can ever understate what Rheneas has done. But Skarloey, I think, has people don't really realize how much he's done for the dynamic and how much he's done for everybody there. They're both guiding figures, founding fathers of this environment that, without either one of them, the railway would be totally different. Without Rheneas, the railway wouldn't exist at all. And without Skarloey, the railway would be a pretty bleak place, mainly with a patriarch who has been through so much that he's not really able to give the proper emotional advice and guidance that the railway needs. Because Rheneas sheltered Skarloey from all the difficulties of the hard times, he's now emotionally intact in a way that Rheneas, on some level, isn't. On some level, Rheneas, I'm sure, has kind of lasting mental scars from having to struggle that much during that time period. And Skarloey was kind of sheltered from that. He has the ability now to put in that emotional input to the railway and the engines who are there, and to provide that healthy environment and help guide everyone in the right direction.
Definitely. The two are so intertwined. It's kind of hard to talk about one without talking about the other.
I wonder exactly what because Edward is so much like Skarloey, and I don't think he's less equipped than Skarloey to give emotional advice and be a good kind of guiding presence. So I wonder what the difference is. I wonder if the difference is just the fact that on the narrow gauge railway, all the engines are like the same size. Gordon could kind of ascend to the rank that he had because he was so big and strong and powerful. Nobody else could do what he did, and if he throws a fit, the whole railway's in trouble. Whereas, that's not the case on the narrow gauge railway. So the better personalities...
That, and I feel like no one's ever under threat of, being replaced on the narrow gauge line. Unlike on the
That's
standard gauge
interesting.
line, where the standard gauge engines fear modernization, the narrow gauge engines, like Rusty comes along and it's just, oh look, it's another engine. Okay. Yeah.
That is really interesting because it's such a specific small railway. It never really had that same, response to modernization. Because modernization was like a standard gauge thing, right?
That, and I think it's always kind of like thought of from the beginning that the Skarloey Railway is very touristy and stuff like that. And so it's kind of just thought of from the start that even if diesels do come in and become the new norm, that, steam is kind of a, the word escapes me, just kind of a novelty, yeah. And that they'll always have a place in narrow gauge.
And for God's sake, they named Skarloey after their touristiest location, right?
Right.
And that's the whole point. And Rheneas after like the arguably second touristiest location, right?
Yeah.
And that's the thing. The engines are intertwined with this history of tourism, and so they're not going to swap them out.
Even if the railway was built for mining.
Yeah, that's true. It very much has evolved over the years.
Talk about a glow up.
But it's interesting. The one time we saw any level of diesel racism on this railway was when James talked to Duncan.
Yeah.
That was literally it.
It was just like in Rock and Roll when Duncan was just like, I don't need a diesel telling me what to do. Like, and that almost does make me wonder, like, they said he worked near a factory. I do wonder if like a diesel took his job almost, and just to give him the slightest little bit of diesel racism, but not enough.
I've never thought about that. That's really, really good. And then I love the idea that years later he's talking to Rusty, and it just comes up. He's like, oh yeah, Diesel took my job back at my old factory, and Rusty's just like, what? You never told me that. And Duncan's just
I didn't think it was that important.
Yeah, exactly. He basically just I love the idea that he would never bring it up because, not in his mind, it's like, well, if he's trying to convince somebody of it, well, not everybody was replaced by a diesel, so that argument doesn't work for everybody, so he's not going to bring up a personal thing like that. He would probably see it as a little bit scummy. But yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right in that dieselization isn't a thing for this narrow gauge railway.
Right. I mean, the most they have to worry about in modernization is like with the mines and stuff like that, and apparently the slate quarry is already owned by the Ministry of Defense at this point in the railway series.
Yeah. but basically I just think those two characters dictate how the whole the vibe of the railway functions, because Skarloey is present, because Skarloey is who he is, and because Rheneas' sacrifices allowed Skarloey to be who he is. He was able to shape the Skarloey Railway into a very emotionally healthy, open place where everybody can talk about their problems, and the worst fights that you get are really not a big deal at all and quite petty.
It's really just when Sir Handel wakes up on the wrong side of the shed.
Yeah, which happens to anybody, right? I mean, it's really like not a big, deal. It's like, sure, Sir Handel has an attitude, Duncan has an attitude sometimes, but it's like, it's easy to get through. Okay, so I think we've said pretty much. I mean, we could talk about Skarloey for hours, of course. I think really there's a lot to be pulled out of him, but I think that we've done a good job of kind of covering him and talking about who he is as a character and just delving into him in general. So
yeah,
I think
he's good. Just overall a real wise guy with a lot of sympathy. Yeah,
that's very much who he is, and it's just like I think one of the biggest things here that we've done is kind of differentiated Skarloey from Rheneas, because I think that it's a lot of the time people tend to lump them together, but I think they do have a lot of really interesting differences that really I think should be exploited more, because they really could make some great stories.
Right, definitely.
So that's pretty much all we've got for today. I've been Master of the Lemons, a.k.a. Lemmy.
And I've been Rudy Productions, a.k.a. Dustin.
And thank you for watching Character Gallery.
Peace.